when I opened the mail and found a letter from the Greater Magnolia Homeowners Association, HOA. At first glance, it looked like one of those routine HOA newsletters or membership offers. But as soon as I started reading, my mood shifted. The letter began with a polite but firm reminder that my property was located within their jurisdiction, and as such, I was required to follow their community guidelines. Then it quickly escalated into a demand. Failure to comply with the HOA regulations may result in immediate legal action. They were demanding that I join their association and adhere to their standards I had never agreed to. The list of violations they cited was laughable. My property wasn't a mansion, but it wasn't run down either. The lawn had a few wildflowers growing, my mailbox wasn't the right style, and my garden had a fence that didn't meet their arbitrary measurements. Nothing that could possibly warrant such an ultimatum. I knew I had the legal right to live on my property without being forced into some HOA. As a judge, I had spent years in the courtroom, defending property rights and seeing cases like this play out. I was well aware that no HOA could compel me to join their association. So I tossed the letter aside, assuming it was just another misguided attempt to harass a property owner into paying membership dues. Little did I know that was just the beginning. For the next few weeks, I thought little of the HOA's demands. After all, I was a judge well-versed in the law, and I knew that no private association could force its will on me. I had every intention of ignoring their letters and getting back to my life. But as time passed, the HOA's tactics started to escalate. They sent more letters, each more forceful than the last, threatening fines, legal action, and inspections if I didn't join the association. One letter even mentioned community standards enforcement and the possibility of my property being seized for failure to comply. I threw every single letter straight into the trash. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I received an unexpected knock at the door. Two men in business suits were standing on my porch, carrying clipboards. They introduced themselves as inspectors from the Greater Magnolia HOA and insisted they needed to enter my property to conduct an inspection. They didn't have a warrant, and they couldn't give me a legitimate reason for the inspection, just that I was in violation of their community standards. I told them firmly, "You have no legal right to enter my property. I don't belong to your HO, and I don't intend to. If you don't leave now, I will call the sheriff." They left without saying another word, but something about the interaction stuck with me. It was as if they were testing the waters, trying to see how far they could push me before I would comply. It was clear that they weren't going to back down easily. Despite the harassment, I remained calm. I had the law on my side. But what I didn't realize was that the HOA had something much more sinister planned. Things took a darker turn a few weeks after the visit from the inspectors. It started with small acts of intimidation. I began to find strange markings on my driveway, almost as if someone was measuring it. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then it started happening more frequently, each time in different spots around my property. It wasn't until I noticed a few unfamiliar vehicles parked along the road near my house, sitting there for hours, that I started to feel like I was being watched. One evening, while I was enjoying a quiet dinner at home, I noticed someone walking around the back of my house. They were wearing a dark hoodie, and when I opened the window to confront them, they quickly disappeared into the trees at the edge of my property. I knew something was off. This wasn't just an HOA enforcing community guidelines anymore. This was personal. The next morning, I woke up to find a letter on my doorstep, this time not from the HOA, but from an anonymous sender. It read, "You think you're untouchable because of your position, but we can make things difficult for you. Join the HOA, or we will take matters into our own hands." At first, I thought it was just another veiled threat from the HOA. But when I looked out the window and saw a few of the same vehicles parked near my house again, this time with people inside, I realized this was something more sinister than I'd originally thought. They were trying to break me. They were trying to wear me down, to force me into submission with their underhanded tactics. But as a judge, I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't about to be bullied by anyone, no matter who they were. I called my lawyer and made sure everything was documented, but I knew deep down that this wouldn't stop until I stood up to them in a more direct way. And that's when things took a turn I never expected. A few days after the threatening letter, I woke up to a nightmare. The first thing I noticed was the acrid smell of smoke hanging in the air. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding, and rushed to the window. What I saw took my breath away. The rear of my house was engulfed in flames. The fire had spread quickly, licking the sides of the barn and threatening to consume the entire property. The smoke was thick, black, and billowing up into the sky, visible for miles around. I sprinted to the phone, dialing 911. The operator's voice was calm but urgent as she assured me that help was on the way. But in the back of my mind, I already knew what was happening. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some random fire. This was deliberate. The HOA had crossed a line from harassment to outright criminal activity. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The damage was severe. The fire had destroyed the back half of my house, and the barn that had been standing for generations was now nothing but a smoldering ruin. Firefighters worked tirelessly, but the damage had already been done. As the fire department began their investigation, I stood there, watching as the last of the smoke drifted away, leaving behind the charred remnants of my home. It hit me then, this wasn't just about property violations anymore. This was an attempt to force me out of my home, to destroy my life because I refused to bow to their demands. I knew the HOA had crossed a line, but I wasn't going to let them win. I was a judge. I had the knowledge and resources to fight back. I wasn't about to let them destroy everything I had worked for. And then the worst part came. The fire investigator, after a few moments of inspection, looked at me and said, "This fire wasn't an accident. It was intentionally set. And the accelerants used point to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't just a random act of vandalism or arson. It was personal. It was calculated." And I knew then that the HOA had gone too far. The fire had barely been put out before I started digging into the situation. I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA was behind it, and after speaking with a few of my neighbors, I realized I wasn't the only one who had been harassed by them. The HOA had a long history of using intimidation and underhanded tactics to force people into their association, but this was different. They had taken it too far. I didn't waste any time. As soon as the fire was out and the initial investigation was complete, I contacted the local sheriff's department. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to let this go, not when I had a clear sense of who was behind it. Sheriff Ramirez arrived on the scene shortly after I called. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, someone who wasn't easily fooled. He immediately took control of the situation, but even he could see how much more was at play here. The fire had been set with an intention, and the accelerants used pointed to someone with knowledge of how to spread it quickly. "You're telling me this wasn't an accident?" he asked, as we both stood near the burned remains of my barn. "No," I said firmly. "This was deliberate. I have a strong suspicion that the Greater Magnolia HOA is behind this." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "The HOA? Why would they?" "They've been harassing me for months," I interrupted. "They've been sending letters, issuing fines, showing up uninvited, all to try and get me to join their association. I refused, and now they've escalated to this." Ramirez thought for a moment, his expression hardening. "That's a hell of a claim. But if you're right, this is going to get real ugly real fast." I nodded, already feeling the weight of what lay ahead. "I'll bet everything I own that they're behind it. They've gone too far now, and they need to be held accountable." Ramirez nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'll need to start an investigation. I'll talk to the fire department, check for any other leads. If the HOA's involved, we'll find out." I had no doubt that Ramirez would do everything he could, but I knew this was going to be bigger than just a local investigation. The HOA had power, influence, and a track record of manipulating the system. But I wasn't about to back down. I was a judge, and I would fight to expose the truth. I spent the rest of the day gathering what I could. Photos of the damage, statements from my neighbors who had witnessed the harassment, and a timeline of the HOA's actions against me. I was building my case, and I knew it wouldn't be long before the truth came to light. But what I didn't realize was how far the HOA was willing to go to silence me. After days of investigation and building my case, it was time to confront the HOA directly. I was done waiting. The fire wasn't just an attack on my property. It was an attempt to break me, to intimidate me into compliance. I wasn't going to stand idly by while they destroyed everything I had built. I had to face them head on. I arrived at the HOA's office on a Wednesday morning, a folder full of evidence in hand. I'd gathered everything I could, the fire investigator's report, testimonies from neighbors, and a stack of documents showing the harassment and intimidation tactics they had been using against me for months. I walked into the building, confident but calm, my mind focused. The receptionist looked at me warily, but didn't try to stop me as I made my way into the conference room. Inside, the board members were gathered, their faces tense as they saw me walk in. Karen Whitaker, the president of the HOA, was sitting at the head of the table. She looked me up and down, her eyes cold and calculating. "What's this about, Judge?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I've had enough of your games, Karen," I said, my voice steady. "You've been harassing me for months, sending inspectors, issuing fines for baseless violations, and now, after everything you've done, you've escalated it to arson." There was a long silence as the other board members shifted uncomfortably. Karen's face didn't change, but I could see the flicker of panic in her eyes. "You can't prove that," she said, though there was an edge of nervousness in her voice. "I don't need to prove it anymore," I replied, placing the folder on the table in front of her. "The fire department, the sheriff, and I know exactly what happened. And it's all pointing to you." I laid out the evidence, piece by piece. The testimonies from my neighbors who had seen suspicious vehicles around my property. The fire investigators' report that showed the fire was intentionally set. The letters and fines that had been sent by the HOA in a clear attempt to coerce me into joining. Karen's face paled as she glanced at the papers, her composure slipping. She wasn't used to being confronted so directly, especially not by someone who knew the law better than she did. "You can't intimidate me into compliance," I continued. "And I won't back down. This ends now, or I'll make sure it costs you everything." For a moment, she didn't speak. The other board members sat in silence, waiting for her response. Finally, she stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she sneered. "You're just a judge, but you don't understand the power we have here. You're going to regret this." I stood up as well, my posture firm. "You've already crossed the line, and I want to make sure you regret it." "It's over, Karen." I turned and walked out of the room, my heart pounding with adrenaline. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I had made my point. Now, I was going to use every ounce of my power as a judge to bring her and the entire HOA down. With the confrontation at the HOA office behind me, I knew that the real work had just begun. Karen Whitaker and the board had underestimated me, just as I had hoped. They had assumed they could intimidate me into compliance, but I wasn't going to let this go. I had the law on my side, and I would use every ounce of my legal expertise to make sure they paid for what they had done. The first step was filing a lawsuit for damages. My property had been intentionally destroyed, and I wasn't about to let that go unpunished. I enlisted the help of a trusted attorney who had experience with cases involving large organizations and corrupt practices. Together, we prepared a case that would hold the HOA accountable for their actions, everything from the arson to the harassment to their unlawful attempts to extort me. I knew the HOA had deep pockets, but I also knew the legal system well enough to understand how to use their own tactics against them. I dug into their history, looking into past complaints, ongoing lawsuits, and anything that could give me an edge. It didn't take long to uncover several other incidents where the HOA had used intimidation and underhanded tactics to push residents into selling or complying with their demands. I wasn't just fighting for my property anymore. I was fighting for every person the HOA had bullied or victimized over the years. I was going to expose them for the corrupt organization they were. I filed for a restraining order to prevent further harassment, and I requested a court order to compel the HOA to produce all documents related to their community enforcement actions. When I showed up to court to file my claims, the clerk gave me a wary glance, clearly recognizing me as a judge. I had earned a reputation for being tough and unyielding, especially when it came to defending property rights, and I could tell the clerks were starting to wonder just how far I would take this. But it wasn't just about the legal victories. It was about using my position to shine a light on the HOA's corrupt practices. I knew this wouldn't be an easy battle, but as I sat in my office, reviewing my evidence and preparing my arguments, I felt a sense of resolve solidifying inside me. I wasn't just taking down a corrupt HOA. I was sending a message to anyone who thought they could get away with bullying others. I wasn't going to stop until Karen Whitaker and the rest of the HOA's board members paid the price for everything they had done. As soon as the legal proceedings began, the HOA's retaliation started in full force. Karen Whitaker and the board weren't going to take this lying down. I knew they would try to fight back, but I wasn't prepared for how far they were willing to go to protect their influence. It started with public smears. The HOA hired a PR firm to spread rumors about me, claiming that I was unfit to serve as a judge. They even went so far as to accuse me of using my position to target their association because of some personal vendetta. I was shocked, but not surprised. They were trying to paint me as the villain in this story, hoping the public would turn against me. The press coverage became a battleground. Articles started popping up on local news websites with headlines like "Judge Under Fire for Personal Attack on HOA" and "Is this judge abusing power to take down a legitimate HOA?" The smear campaign was aggressive, and it started to feel like the whole town was turning against me. But I knew how to fight back. I wasn't just a judge. I had built my career on upholding justice, no matter the personal cost. I knew the truth would win out, and so did my supporters. I reached out to a few trusted colleagues and legal experts, and together we began to counter their false claims. I held press conferences of my own, where I laid out the facts. I showed how the HOA had been harassing me and others, using threats, intimidation, and even illegal tactics like arson to achieve their goals. I called out their misconduct and corruption in public forums, refusing to let them control the narrative. Despite their attempts to ruin my reputation, the truth began to come to light. More residents came forward with stories of their own encounters with the HOA. Some had been forced to pay unjust fines. Others had been threatened with legal action over minor violations, just like I had. The more the HOA tried to silence me, the more support I gained from the community. People were starting to see the reality of the situation. Karen Whitaker wasn't the victim here. I was. But the battle wasn't over. As I continued to expose their lies and corruption, I could feel the HOA tightening their grip, preparing for their next move. It was only a matter of time before they tried something else, something even more desperate. As the case against the HOA progressed, I knew there had to be more to their scheme than what was immediately visible. The harassment, the fire, and the smear campaign were just the surface of something deeper. I wasn't about to let them get away with it, especially when I suspected that Karen Whitaker and the board weren't acting alone. I started digging into the HOA's history, examining past legal cases, corporate filings, and even old community records. What I found shocked me. The HOA had connections to local developers, real estate moguls, and even a few corrupt local officials. Karen Whitaker wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a puppet master, pulling strings behind the scenes to control valuable land and drive residents out of their homes to make way for lucrative development projects. Through my investigation, I uncovered that many of the violations they had been using to pressure homeowners were actually part of a larger strategy to devalue properties in the area. They would fine residents for minor infractions, then use those fines as leverage to convince people to sell their homes at below-market prices. Once enough homes were sold, the HOA could clear out entire neighborhoods and flip the land for massive profits. It was all carefully orchestrated, and I had no doubt that Karen and the other board members were in it for the money. They had been using the HOA as a front for a real estate conspiracy, and they had no intention of stopping till they had taken over the whole community. The more I uncovered, the more disgusted I became. It was clear that I wasn't just fighting for my own property anymore. I was fighting for the entire neighborhood. People had been quietly suffering under the weight of this corrupt system, and now that I knew the full extent of their operation, I was determined to bring it all to light. I began to compile all the evidence I had found, building a much stronger case than I ever anticipated. The documents, testimonies, and insider information I had gathered painted a clear picture of just how deep the corruption went. It was no longer just about me versus the HOA. It was about protecting the entire community from their greed. With this new information, I called in my lawyer and began preparing to go after not just Karen Whitaker and the board, but the entire network behind them. The legal battle was about to get much bigger, and I was ready for it. At this point, I had accumulated enough evidence to bring down the entire operation, but I knew I needed to take a more personal approach. I wasn't just a judge anymore. I had become a symbol of resistance, and I had the power to make sure Karen Whitaker and her cohorts faced real consequences for what they had done. It was time to use my position, my reputation, and my legal expertise to turn the tide in my favor. I scheduled a press conference. I had a decision to make, reveal who I truly was, an experienced, feared judge known for holding powerful people accountable, or keep playing the role of just another victim of the HOA's corruption. I decided to reveal everything. At the press conference, I walked up to the podium, the weight of the moment settling in. The cameras clicked on, the reporters shuffled, and the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. I could sense the tension. Everyone knew this wasn't just another typical HOA story. I wasn't just a local resident fighting against a corrupt group. I was someone with the legal authority and power to dismantle their empire. Good afternoon. I began, my voice steady, the eyes of the community on me. You know me as a judge in this town. I've spent years making difficult decisions in the courtroom, making sure justice is served. But what I'm about to share with you is something I've never had to face as a judge. This is personal. I paused, allowing my words to sink in. The Greater Magnolia HOA has been terrorizing homeowners, coercing them into selling their properties, and using their power to bully residents into submission. I've been one of their victims, just like many of you. But I didn't realize just how far this would go. They've tried to ruin my life, destroy my property, and now they've escalated their harassment to arson. I could see the reporters shift in their seats, scribbling notes, some looking up at me with newfound respect. This wasn't the judge they expected to speak out like this. It was a judge who had become a force to be reckoned with. And now I'm using every tool at my disposal to bring them down, I continued. This isn't just about me anymore. This is about every person they've tried to intimidate, every homeowner they've pushed out of their homes for the sake of profits. I will not let this go unchallenged. The room went silent for a moment before a wave of murmurs started again, this time with an air of admiration. The community was waking up to the truth. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for justice, and I was leading the charge. I'm asking for your support, not just for me, but for all those who've been silent victims for too long. Together, we will make sure the Greater Magnolia HOA and its corrupt leaders pay for what they've done. As I left the podium, I could feel the weight of the moment. I had just made it clear that the judge they thought they could control was the one who would bring them to justice. No more hiding. No more playing by their rules. The media coverage exploded, and within hours, people from all over the community began to reach out, offering their own testimonies about the HOA's abuses. My story had sparked something bigger. And as more and more people came forward, I knew the battle had only just begun, but I was ready for it. After the press conference, the HOA was rattled. They hadn't expected me to come out so publicly against them, especially not with such a strong, unified stance. Karen Whitaker and the other board members were no longer confident. They had underestimated me, thinking I would fold under their pressure, but now they were realizing that they had created a nightmare for themselves. Within days, I was back in court, filing motions, presenting evidence, and rallying the community behind me. I had the legal expertise, the public backing, and the moral high ground. The truth was on my side, and every piece of evidence I presented built a clearer case against the HOA and its corrupt practices. I wasn't just seeking justice for myself anymore. I was making sure that the entire system would be exposed. People had been too afraid to speak out for years, but now they had a judge, someone with authority, standing up for them. Witnesses came forward. Residents who had been too afraid to challenge the HOA were now willing to testify about their own experiences. The final showdown came when Karen Whitaker and the board tried to argue in court that the fire had been an unfortunate accident and that they were only trying to uphold community standards. But the more they spoke, the worse it became for them. They couldn't explain away the evidence that tied them to the arson. They couldn't deny the trail of fraudulent documents and the personal vendetta they had waged against me. Every lie they told unraveled before the court, and their once powerful network began to crumble. I stood in front of the judge, presenting the final pieces of the puzzle. This isn't about community standards, I said, my voice firm. This is about greed and corruption. The HOA's actions were intentional. They didn't just set fire to my property, they set fire to the truth, and they tried to burn down my life to cover up their scheme. I laid out the evidence that connected Karen Whitaker and the board to a larger network of corruption, showing how they had used the HOA to bully people into selling their properties, leveraging fines, and exploiting the system for their own gain. The room was silent as I finished my statement. The judge nodded, clearly seeing the weight of the case. The court finds the defendants guilty of arson, fraud, and conspiracy, the judge announced. The Greater Magnolia HOA will be dissolved, and its board members are to be held accountable for their actions. As the gavel came down, I could feel the victory surging through me. This wasn't just a personal win. It was a win for everyone who had been affected by the HOA's malicious actions. Karen Whitaker and her cohorts had lost. They were going to face criminal charges, and the corrupt organization they had built was going to be dismantled. But the victory didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, the media coverage was explosive. People came forward from every corner of the community, revealing the depth of the HOA's manipulation. What had started as a small confrontation between one homeowner and a corrupt HOA had turned into a community-wide movement for justice. After the court's ruling, the fallout was swift and far-reaching. The Greater Magnolia HOA was dissolved, its board members, including Karen Whitaker, facing serious criminal charges for arson, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The damage they had caused was staggering, but justice had been served, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. In the aftermath, things started to change. The media continued to report on the case, and soon local lawmakers began to take action to prevent something like this from happening again. New regulations were put in place to increase oversight of homeowners associations, ensuring that they couldn't abuse their power to harass residents or force people into submission. It was a long overdue move, but I knew it was only the beginning of holding these organizations accountable. For me personally, the victory was sweet. The fire that had destroyed my home had been the spark that ignited the truth, and in the end, it wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about protecting an entire community from the clutches of a corrupt organization. I had used my position, my experience as a judge, and my knowledge of the law to fight back, and in doing so, I had exposed something much larger than I ever anticipated. But even though I had won, the battle had taken its toll. My life, my reputation, and my home had been put to the test, but in the end, I had remained unbroken. The scars from the fire would remain, but the victory was greater than any material loss I had endured. As for the future, the victory was not just mine. It was shared by every resident who had been bullied, intimidated, or forced out of their home. People who had been silent for years found their voices. The community came together in ways I hadn't seen before. Together, we had fought back against an oppressive force and won. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe easy. The fight was over, and justice had prevailed.